Hi everyone, I'm Raj Kumar, President and Editor-in-Chief of Devex. This week we'll be breaking down the big headlines in global development and bringing in some top experts to help us do it. If you want to follow along with the stories we're talking about, check out Devex.com and subscribe to our daily newsletter, The Newswire. There's a link in the description. Follow us along on Twitter and you can see many of the stories we're talking about today, and we'd love to hear what you think. This is This Week in Global Development.
I've got to just describe the scene to you, where I am right now. I'm sitting in, it's a very World Bank Spring Meetings classic moment. I'm inside the World Bank in a lounge that's been set up to sort of advertise the annual meeting coming into Marrakesh. And I'm looking across at Rachel Kyte, who is joining us in this conversation in just a moment. And Rachel is surrounded, she's framed by beautiful mannequins wearing amazing dresses from Morocco. There are Moroccan lamps. It's quite a scene. It does make me want to look ahead to the annual meetings, which I think we'll talk about today as well. It's been a busy week, and we're just going to talk about what happened. So I've got, as I mentioned, with me here, the one and only Rachel Kyte, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School, who has been a leader in the climate movement, a special envoy on climate. She's had many roles. People don't need an introduction in this world, I think. And I want to hear from her. And we've got Jeremy Hillman as well, my friend, who is currently at Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth, but has worn many hats, including running communications here at the World Bank, at the Gates Foundation, working at Microsoft, et cetera, a longtime BBC journalist. Jeremy, Rachel, hi.
Hey, Raj. I feel very sad not to be with you, but I can picture the scene.
We've got some mint tea for you, Jeremy.
It is quite a scene. So let's just dive in. The point of this conversation, besides the fact that I'd love to just talk to the two of you anytime I get that chance, is to hear what you think happened this week. You know, what are some of the highlights? What are some of the things that came out? And of course, I've got some reflections of my own. But maybe, Rachel, I can just start with you. What's top of mind?
Well, it's been quite an extraordinary week because there's a lot of drama running up to this meeting. Change in leadership at the World Bank Group itself, with Ajay Banga as the presumptive president, and lots of conversation about how to get the international financial system fit for purpose for a poly crisis, a debt crisis, a climate crisis, slowing economic growth, really quite devastating figures coming out in the IMF at the beginning of the week. And what I've detected here is we're a long way from implementing things differently, but are sort of coalescing around the fact that things do need to change. Some short-term things that we can do within the current structure, but really some very serious conversations about how the structures themselves and the rules of the road are going to have to be reformed. So a quite sober, practical meeting, I think, but with an awful lot of work to do between now and Marrakesh.
You know what it reminds me of? It's that movie, The Two Popes. You've got, literally this happened yesterday. You had David Malpass here at the World Bank, of course, the current president, and then you had Ajay Banga coming through the offices. You have these two popes, in a sense, very different worldviews, very different backgrounds. And it's like when we had, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis in the Vatican at the same time, with coming from completely different perspectives, but, trying to coexist. And these spring meetings is fascinating in that you've got the old guard, you've got a current sitting president, in some ways saying the same things as Ajay Banga, who's been running around the city on the outskirts of town, having a million bilateral meetings as he prepares to take over the role, probably July 1st, maybe a bit sooner. It's just a fascinating moment. I don't think there's anything like it before. Jeremy, you, of course, know Ajay. What's your take on this week? What's top of mind for you?
Yeah. Well, I agree with what Rachel said. Caveat is I haven't spent a lot of time at the bank and the fund this week because I've been pretty busy with our little Global Inclusive Growth Summit that you know well, Raj, and we work together on. But I feel it is this strange sort of interregnum. It's almost this meetings of anticipation. I do feel there's been this huge urgency and reality to the conversations. There's not been a lot of diplomatic niceties skirting around the issues. There's been pretty real conversations about what needs to be done. Quite a lot of excitement about change in leadership at the bank, but we're not quite there yet. So it's been almost this slight sort of vacuum. And as you say, these two circling personalities, David who I worked with, closely for a long time, on the way out, and Ajay on the way in. And it's been a very strange atmosphere. But also, I think a huge amount of activity in Washington and around the meetings as well. More, I think, than previous years. This whole ecosystem feels like it's building to me of taking these meetings more seriously. A lot of different side events, not just our own one, but a lot of other organizations, a lot more private sector figures, I think, in town than usual, which is not surprising, given that, the sort of direction that Ajay's likely to take things. So, really interesting week.
Yeah, and I think this really strong message that while this presidential transition is important, it's not about one man, right? So obviously, Ajay trying to manage expectations, but some really tough talking going on between governments. The developing world or the global south, finding their voice. I mean, Mia Mottley saying to John Kerry, if all you're going to do is talk, please be quiet. You've got to bring money, you've got to bring action, you've got to bring deliverables. And that was on sort of climate finance and restructuring the international system so it helps pay countries or invest in countries before they're hit by disaster rather than bailing them out afterwards. And then I was talking to, former colleagues at the bank who were like, just enough with the blah, blah, blah. We have got to find ways to make the money available for what is needed, and it's just too easy to sort of, ask for reform. We've got to get down into the nitty gritty. So a real sense that countries themselves know they've got to get into underneath the hood of this institution and make it work. Somebody told me yesterday that over $30 billion worth of sort of funds that have gone to the board and approved are sitting there not dispersed, right? And we're in the middle of a crisis. This money's got to flow out of the system much more quickly. So I think quite sober.
Yeah, there's
and Rachel, you're obviously right. It's not about one man, but there's this huge expectation been building. And we both got 100 colleagues, thousands of colleagues at the bank, and they're sort of hanging off every word. Ajay was on NPR this morning. He's been everywhere, as Raj says, and everyone is passing every word and working out what to expect. And I think that's been fascinating because, these expectations are huge and maybe unmanageable in the short term. And this honeymoon period is not going to be long. There's a lot of urgency.
Yeah, and real consensus that, things are good. Instruments have to be used differently. Money has to be leveraged differently. Balance sheets need to be used differently. But the culture has to change. Too inward looking, too slow, too risk averse. And I think that, how he comes in and sets a tone from the top is what everybody's waiting for. So, we, as Raj said, a sort of strange interregnum.
Yeah, I interviewed Axel von Trotzenberg and Anna Bierde, who are the elevated managing directors. Axel has this new role of senior managing director, and Anna is the new managing director for operations, Axel's old job. And they're kind of, everyone's singing from the same psalm book, it feels like, right? They're saying all the right stuff around private sector now. There seems to be this coalition building behind the evolution roadmap. But then I run into lots of skeptics here. They say, come on, people are saying that, but it's like any other bureaucracy, it's going to be entrenched. They've been doing this for many years, and they're going to expect, Banga to do the fireworks on the outside, and internally in the bank, nothing's really going to change. So I don't know if either of you have perspectives about that, but I feel like I run into probably an equal number of people who are excited, optimistic, and then the skeptics who say, hey, this institution never can change.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting, and Ajay's been out there sort of saying it publicly and privately, is, it's not about structural change. It is about culture, as Rachel said. And Ajay's got this amazing track record of leading, complex organizations and shifting and setting culture. So that's where I think it's going to be fascinating. And he's been talking a lot about outcomes and incentives and not restructuring and how I'm going to organize things. He's going to be sort of, I feel really focused on that. And it's going to be a sort of fascinating to see how that plays out in the context of the bank that we all know really well.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at Devex. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to Devex Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. Our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In Devex Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive Devex Newswire and visit devex.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
If you think about what's different about Ajay Banga, look back at all the World Bank presidents we've ever had. So we've had investment bankers. They're not really managers. These are finance guys from Wall Street. We've had them before. We've had people who come from the world of government. I'm thinking of like Paul Wolfowitz. Even probably the most celebrated former World Bank president in Jim Wolfenson, he was more of a finance guy, right? He built his own investment bank, a boutique firm. Ajay Banga is the first manager really ever to take this job, like the first person who's had to manage 10, 15, I think 17,000 employees or something like that, 20,000 employees. He's the first person who has that characteristic, which is part of what the Treasury Department was using to sell him when they were calling governments and saying, hey, this is our pick, that he's going to lead a change management process at the World Bank. Not exactly, as you say, Jeremy, not just a structural reform, but as Rachel says, a cultural change.
Yeah, and I think that it's multiple balance sheets as well. We talk about the bank, but it's the bank group. We've got IDA, we've got IBID, we've got IFC, MEGA. All of them need to be much greater, leveraged to a much greater effect. But I think I've heard a couple of really interesting observations. I've been named to a G20 expert group on MDB reform, so very interesting to sort of make recommendations on MDB reform when you've got this transition. And I think that in previous, this is not the first rodeo on MDB reform over the last few decades, but previously, when we were talking about MDB reform, it was about let's change the bank, and then all the other regional development banks and other banks sort of all follow on, right? This time there's a feeling that there's a real MDB system that has to be reformed. The bank, of course, is primus inter pares, but it is the system now. You've got a new development bank. You've got the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. You've got the regional development banks that are really quite moving ahead of the bank in many ways in terms of their assertion and their aggression around inclusion and around climate and things like that. So now, the bank is, one jewel in a crown of jewels. And so that's, I think, quite different than previously. And huge expectations of Ajay.
And by the way, Rachel, exactly to your point, one person just told me recently, look at the evolution roadmap, it's all about the World Bank. And that's got to change, meaning it is not just a conversation about how does the World Bank reform. It's a conversation about the broader MDB system, exactly as you described. Because if you think of it from the perspective of the shareholder countries, it's not so much one institution or another. They're looking at global public goods, global systemic challenges, especially climate. And they're saying, all right, what are all the tools at our disposal? How do we harmonize those? And it doesn't matter if the World Bank makes a few changes if the whole system hasn't changed.
Yeah, so you hear the phrase radical collaboration being mentioned, right? And so, stand in the shoes of the country that's borrowing, right, from the system. And, how many, there's been more and more coordination amongst the banks in the last 20 years. There's been more alignment of policies and strategies and things like that. But you're still having to deal with a system. You have to deal with your regional development bank, then you have to deal with the World Bank, and then you have to deal with the IMF, then you have to deal, is there a way that the system can be more user-friendly even than what we've got now? So I think these are big questions. It's all on the table. And as Ajay Banga arrives and has to make sure that culture doesn't kill strategy at the bank group, he's going to be the convener-in-chief, the collaborator-in-chief for the whole system.
Especially...
Rachel, I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on this whole sort of debate around how does the bank define itself? Is it the poverty alleviation bank? Is it the climate bank? And I don't buy that as being such this clear distinction. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts.
We actually just published a survey today of development professionals in the Devex community. 900 of them, about a third, worked at the World Bank. And as you might expect, the majority really don't see such a clear dichotomy between the two. They can see the connection point. Development professionals get it that climate and development are quite linked. But there's a substantial minority who see this as something of a trade-off and are concerned about that. And many, more than I expected, who said, you know what, maybe the bank shouldn't become a climate bank as its first priority. Maybe there's too much of a trade-off here, and it should continue to just focus on poverty as its main goal. So I think it's a narrative issue because I personally don't think of it as a real dichotomy. I think it's a false dichotomy. But there is some work to be done, even still, on generating a narrative that everybody can get behind as to what the main point of the bank is.
So I think this is a gravy problem. If you've got a lot of gravy, it becomes less of an issue. What I mean by that is, if we were leveraging and generating, hundreds and hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars of investment into green economy globally, then I don't think this would be a problem. But at the moment, for IDA countries, so the low-income countries, they are desperately in need of budget support for health and education and all of the other things that are going on as the global economy slows. And the idea that development money is going to go to a middle-income country for green infrastructure and green power, and not perhaps, and the fear that would be a trade-off then between them getting budget support for what they really need. And of course, they want to have green infrastructure and clean air and all the rest of it as well. But they're just worried that it's always going to be a trade-off. And I think it's interesting when you talk to executive directors here at the banks, so the members of the board, and they'll tell you that, what borrowing countries are asking for is poverty alleviation. They're not asking for climate. Now, if you travel and you go to a capital city and you sit and talk to the Minister of Finance of the capital city, they'll tell you that climate is taking percentage points of GDP away. It's cratering their ability to invest in what's necessary. So I think it's how do people use the system when they worry that the system isn't capitalized and leveraged effectively? There isn't enough money for everything.
Yeah, and I'd recommend a blog post that just came out from Hans-Peter Lankas, who's formerly of the World Bank. You all know him, on the ODI website, and he gets into this in some detail, basically saying, let's get away from the idea that the low-income countries, we just focus on poverty there, and climate just in middle income. And he's got a series of really detailed ideas about how you can better use concessional finance in the lowest income countries, and a reminder that actually, these climate issues, they're going to hit the low-income countries the worst. Right, so mitigation matters there too. Not that you need to do mitigation in those countries because they're big emitters, they're not, but because climate matters there as well. And so part of it, I think, is this, maybe just coming from a journalistic standpoint, but a lot of it, to my mind, is a narrative formation problem. The way we talk about this, like when we say climate, a lot of people are imagining, solar panels and windmills, right? But I'm thinking about things like drought-resistant seeds. Like if we think about climate as adaptation, it fits very neatly into what we traditionally would call global development.
Yeah, and I mean, Jeremy, you guys at Mastercard, you're doing this, right? I mean, bringing together the whole discussion around financial inclusion and adaptation and resilience to climate change. I think that when you turn the sort of hourglass all the way around and you stand in the shoes of a small business owner, in the outskirts of a town, a growing town in, a Sahelian country, then there isn't any dichotomy between climate and development, or poverty alleviation and shared prosperity and climate. It's basically all the same thing. And then the further you get away from that ultimate beneficiary of the system, the more language gets in the way.
That's right. I mean, it's easy to go down this rabbit hole of sort of false dichotomies, but the interrelationships are so clear, and it's what we've spent the whole week, at our Inclusive Growth Summit, with Raj and yourself, Rachel, discussing all these different sort of lenses on inclusive growth, and they're all part of the same, they're all part of the same subject.
I'd love to get the take from both of you on the kind of real news that came out this week, because I think there's sort of two major news headlines. One is that China agreed that it will work with the MDBs to come to some kind of agreement around restructuring debt in the countries that are right on the brink, right, of default. And that's a big headline. And essentially, it sounds like the World Bank and other MDBs have agreed, look, in exchange, we're not going to restructure our debt. It has most seniority in the world, but we'll do some more concessional finance through IDA to try to grease the skids in these countries. That, to me, seems one big headline. And the other big one, there was no headline around it, but I think it's just a reality that we've all realized there is not going to be a general capital increase. Right, there's not going to be more money coming into this bank, even with Ajay Banga joining. Right, and there seems to have been a message from the U.S. and the other major shareholders, certainly the Western ones, saying, "Look, we need to find a way to quote unquote sweat the balance sheet more with what we have already, leverage it more." What do you think, Rachel? Maybe starting with you. Like, do those seem like the big headlines for you, or is there something else we're missing? What's your take?
Well, so on debt, yeah, I think that's a big headline, and I think that especially sitting in Washington, there's sort of when you come to Washington, when you don't live here, as soon as you land, it's like China, China, China. I mean, it is a town obsessed, and I've heard important European figures and others sort of saying, look, there's got to be a way to engage, and then China observers sort of saying, okay, well, there's this very tense geopolitical language of friction between the US and China, but underneath, watch what China is saying and watch what China is doing, and you can see that there's room for pragmatism in there. And Scott Morris at CGD has always called for zones of cooperation inside MDBs and within the MDB and IMF system. I hope that sense can prevail and we can continue to build that. On the general capital increase, I think it's too early for that, right? First of all, Bangor has to come in. We have to sweat that balance sheet a bit more. I think there's this discussion around callable capital as opposed to paid-in capital. But there is also, when you come at it from the perspective of the climate emergency, where we're talking about $2 to $2.8 trillion a year of investment needed in green infrastructure, etc. Even if you sweat the balance sheet and give the bank a global capital increase, we're still going to be tens of billions better off, but not trillions, right? So the trillions, well, where do they come from? Well, look at all the sovereign funds that are not leveraging themselves. Look at all these other parts of the system that are not leveraged yet. And I think for the owners and for countries out there, there's a really big question about what they're going to do, not just through the World Bank Group, but on their own account. And I think that increasingly for developing countries, if they don't see some movement this year, and they don't see any movement in COP28, and the UAE is walking around with some finance proposals in very early stage, sort of gut checking people on what they might do. I think if we don't make some kind of breakthroughs in terms of the money outside of the World Bank Group, then we're going to have a pretty parlous end to the year.
And Raj, I guess I think your two headlines are probably pretty decent ones. I don't think I've got much to add on the debt, other than I'd probably note that I think you can argue a lot about David Malpass's legacy, but I think he has been early and strong on sovereign debt since the day he started at the bank, and I think he's got ahead of this, and he's really led the debates and discussions, and it's why I think there's a discussion around a mixed legacy for David, but he's been I think he's been incredibly strong and taken the bank in the right direction and led that conversation. But on the leverage issue, I think you're right. I mean, there's not going to be a capital increase out of the gate in any short term, but I think it's going to depend on how new leadership at the bank and how the bank shows it's leveraging its balance sheet right now. How is it doing? Is it working effectively and well? And then I wouldn't discount, in a decent period of time, that discussion starting to gain momentum again. But there's got to be some action and some movement first, because it's not going to happen quickly.
I mean, just on the sort of how do you sweat the system to do more? There's been lots of conversations this week about the credit rating agencies and, whether or not, all of the MDBs together, talk to the credit rating agencies about opening up the way in which they are managed or evaluated. How much more could you achieve if you were able to get some kind of collective agreement about how MDBs are treated? So I think that conversation has certainly picked up speed this week.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to synthesize all the many discussions I've had, but I did hear from one senior person in the finance world saying, look, be very careful what you wish for. Like, we're all talking about sweating the balance sheet, but we may be heading into a worse global fiscal situation. And this banking crisis maybe gets worse. And that's when you really feel good that you've got a gold-plated AAA balance sheet. So, credit rating. So, you can see there's a diversity of perspectives here, which is part of why the expectations around Banga are so high, because people feel like something has to change and he's the most visible change coming, very, very soon. It's a really crazy moment. I mean, I don't think I've been to a lot of spring meetings. I don't think there's been one with this level of attention and energy, as Jeremy, you rightly said, like with the ecosystem around the actual bank meetings, and even the media attention and the journalists that are here. There's a lot more focus than ever, right here this week.
Yeah, and just on that, tackling that inertia around the AAA and pressuring the balance sheet, that is one issue inside the bank where I think Ajay faces a lot of internal, resistance and a lot of, and I think it's going to be really tough to navigate that.
Yeah, I think that the sort of playing with the AAA is almost off the table. It's how within that AAA can the credit rating agencies just recognise the track record of the banks differently and perhaps give them a little bit more space without fiddling with the AAA, because we are, the IMF put out the weakest growth numbers for the world for over 30 years. So I think that's pretty hairy. And I think the other thing is, Ajay Banga by reputation knows how to manage change, knows how to manage big organisations. What you're always struck with at these meetings, that these buildings are jam-packed full of brilliant people. And if you can just unleash their potential, let them take a little bit more risk, let them get rewarded for innovation, measure them for outcomes rather than just for the volume of what they take to the board. I thought, people should listen to Ajay Banga's interview with NPR this morning on Morning Edition, because I thought he was pitch perfect. And, that's really where the excitement is.
And the speech he gave to CGD, echoed those points really strongly as well. I mean, he's been really clear on that. It's all about incentives and outcomes.
Yeah, I think I agree. The people here are brilliant, but one of the other themes I've picked up this week is, maybe we need either different people, or we need the people who are here, as brilliant as they are, to essentially learn a new trade, because the trade they've got is more akin to a traditional banker, right? They're focusing on loans, and we need to be more like investment bankers focused on deals, right? Thinking about how you bring in the private sector. We had Julie Monaco from Citi on stage just a couple hours ago here in the atrium. I thought she was brilliant about, look, you want to do a new innovation and you get lots of attention. Everyone comes to the meetings. They get a new financial innovation off the ground. You want to scale it. Nobody has time or energy or attention to actually scale it. So you have all these interesting innovations all over the place, but what we need now is scale if we want to get to those trillions. And she's saying, look, private sector's ready. We're ready to pull up a chair, but we need to have that counterpart. And I think that's what I'm hearing a lot of as well this week.
And risk. I had two perspectives on risk as well. I think internally, you've got to take more risk. You've got to encourage more of that risk taking. Externally, you've got to de-risk, for the private sector. And I think approaching risk in sort of new ways that the bank is not traditionally been comfortable with is really important.
But I think there's also this for the last X many years, everybody's got really sort of high on the concept of blended finance, right? And blended finance is really important. So this is using public money to buy down the risk or to induce in the private sector and private sector finance into places it wouldn't go, to things it wouldn't do on its own. But there are, especially for low-income countries, and whether it's climate adaptation or the hardest poverty alleviation work, there are things that simply are going to have to be fully subsidised or fully concessional or grant money, including some of the capacity that has to be built in countries, right? There is no country in the world that's got the utilities that it needs for 100% renewable energy. There's not a country in the world that's got the legislative framework for the kinds of renewable energy power pools that we need. That doesn't come through blended finance or from lending, or it doesn't come from Goldman Sachs, it doesn't come from Frankfurt or London. It's going to come from good old-fashioned pooled technical assistance. And I think that at the end of the day, we're going to have to find and protect the finances that are needed for that. And I think that, many of the most vulnerable feel very nervous that as the economy slows, as ODA starts to get eaten away like a little Pac-Man, all of that ODA, I'm British, right? It's an absolute crime that $3.4 billion of our own, £3.4 billion are going to pay for refugees in the UK, and we're paying more per refugee than we've ever paid before. It's insane, and the developing countries watch that and they're like, is that money going to be there?
Yeah, maybe that's a good point to end on, in part because I think it was very well said, and in part because I don't know how much longer we can keep all of the adoring fans off of Rachel. We're here in this hallway, and you haven't even been able to see Rachel. All the people coming behind you, ready to tap on your shoulder, not knowing we're on this live event. But look, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that what you highlighted so well that's worth just underlining is, although we're here very focused on these technical matters, dollars and cents, and financial engineering, one thing the spring meetings has really brought home and made clear is, for a lot of countries, there's a real crisis underway right now. Food prices, fertilizer, hunger, This is it's a big macroeconomic story, of course, but the real world development impacts, the humanitarian impacts are big, and they're real. They're happening right now. At the same moment, we're trying to imagine this new world where we can bring to bear a new global financial system and architecture that can get us to the Paris commitment. So this is a big consequential set of meetings this week, and great to get a chance to discuss them with my friends Rachel and Jeremy.
Thanks, Raj.
Thanks, Raj. Keep up the great work, Devex.
This has been This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe using the link in the description. To get even more coverage and analysis on the most pressing development issues of the day, become a Devex Pro member by going to devex.com/membership and signing up. Thank you for listening, and see you next week.